Finally, let's talk about how to optimize your render settings and output. Now that I've got my file set up, I can go ahead and output a usable image. This is some sort of image that I want to either email or include in a presentation, but I need to be able to hand over some sort of JPEG or PNG file in order to work with it. While we're working, our real-time view is constantly going to be rendering, and our image is going to improve the longer we let it sit. This I've been letting sit for a little while, so it's looking really good. If I didn't want to actually go in, hit the render button, and have to wait again to get another image, I could just actually take a screenshot of what I see here on screen. The easiest way to do that is just by hitting the screenshot button down in the bottom right. If I hit screenshot, you'll see that I now have this image that's been saved out as a PNG to my renderings folder. So what I'll do is I'll just pause my real-time view, and if I go to my desktop, I can go into my KeyShot 6 resources, go into the renderings folder, and here is this image that I saved. Mine is saving out a PNG file, which is higher quality than a JPEG. I'll show you where you can change this in your settings. So under Edit and Preferences, we have our general preferences, and what I want to look at is this portion right here for screenshot. The default is JPEG, and that's fine, but the PNG files are generally going to be higher quality. And when you change this to PNG files, it's going to automatically set it to 90% quality. What I want to do is save this out as a PNG at 100% quality. The benefit to doing that is that I could then save this for the web or save a lower resolution or lower quality version like a JPEG if I need to. You'll also notice that by default, it has this checkbox here checked that says Save Camera with each screenshot. That means that I'm going to now get, you can see it here in my list of cameras, I get a camera saved with this screenshot that I added. Those of you who have KeyShot Pro have the option to save a view set with each screenshot, a view set being a combination of your camera and environment settings. So that's going to be the easiest way to work, and that's actually how I tend to work within KeyShot. So now if I just let this sit, I can hit screenshot as soon as the image quality is good enough. The downside here is that this is going to be limited by my screen resolution. So you'll notice here that I have a resolution. So these are the pixel dimensions for my real-time view. So it's 1026 by 577 pixels wide and tall. Okay, so let's talk about what happens when you hit the render button right here. This render dialog will allow us to save out a lot of different image formats, and we can render out image greater than what we see in our real-time view. It's going to automatically give it a name. It's going to put it into our renderings folder, and the default file format is going to be JPEG, which I almost never ever use. The reason for that is that it's going to be the lowest quality image format out of all the options you have here. Generally, I would like to work with PNG files. The benefit with PNG files is that they also have the possibility to include alpha or transparency. So in this screen here, anything that's kind of the background green is going to be transparent. It's going to be transparent, but keep in mind, if you include that transparency, things like shadows or reflections are going to blend into your background color. Those of you who have rendered an image onto a white background and then included transparency and then put it onto a black background have probably noticed this. Those transparent pixels do blend with whatever your background color is. So my tip for you is, if you're working with transparency, make sure that you use a neutral background, definitely neutral, not red or green. And I try to match the intended background color of whatever I'm going to be compositing. Essentially, if you're planning it on a white background, put it on white, or if you're putting on a black, put it on black. But that's small note, but that's something to keep in mind. You do have plenty of other options as well, like Photoshop files. So we can actually render out to native PSD files and PSD 32-bit. My favorite is PNG, but it does depend on what the output is and what your needs are. For example, TIFFs are going to be completely uncompressed EXR 32-bit images, TIFF 32-bit, another format that you have here. What we'll also do is, let's say we're going to render out a higher resolution image. we can use this drop down here and we can see a preset list of screen resolutions. You'll notice that these are all 16 by 9 images, so like 1920 by 1080 or 2560 by 1440. What's important to keep in mind here with the aspect ratio is that this aspect ratio is being driven by the real-time view. So for example, if I type in 1920, I should see that jump to 1080. If I wanted to render out 1920 by 1200, and I try typing in 1200 right here, then hit tab, you'll notice that it changes my my first number to always keep that 16 by 9 aspect ratio. If you want to change that, what you have to do is go into your real-time view, hit the presets drop down, and this is where we can use some other aspect ratio. Let's say, for example, we wanted to do that. We wanted to render out at 1920 by 1200. Well, in this case, that's not going to fit my real-time view. I'll hit 1440 by 900, right? My real-time view, again, there is taking up more space than I have on screen. But now when I go to render, I can type in 1920, and there it is, 1920 by 1200. So it's important to keep in mind that that's going to be driven by our real-time view. So let's talk about, well, those of you who have Pro will have to get into passes at another time, but you can do render passes. You can render objects to separate layers using rendered layers. You also have the option, if you are exporting to a PSD file or Photoshop file, to actually add that to one big Photoshop file. So that's a benefit you do have there. Let's talk about the render options, because there are 3 different ways that we can render. Let's go to the options tab. So the mode, which is default, is using some number of your cores. I usually, for the sake of speed, you want the most number of cores, but for the sake of doing other work at the same time, I generally will free up 1 or 2 cores when I'm going to do even a final render. Let's talk about the quality settings, because there are 3 different ways to use the real-time render. And something to keep in mind is that the rendering engine that's powering our real-time view is the same one that's being used for max samples and max time. So that's very different. That means if I render with either one of these render options, it's going to give me a window and it's going to render everything all at the same time, just like the real-time view. The huge benefit you have there is that if you render using max samples or max time, I prefer max time, is that if I set a rendering to go for something like 5 minutes and I hit the render button, it's going to give me the same results that I'm seeing in my real-time view. The only thing you have to keep in mind is if I were going to render this, let's say at a higher resolution, 2560, something like this, and I go to options and I use max time, well then I may need to let it render for longer time. So I can type in something like 15 minutes. But in 15 minutes, it's going to give me the best rendering it can possibly give me. The other benefit you have with that, and I'll show you an example, is if I hit render, and I let this sit for just a second. And again, this is just like making our real-time view really big. So it's going to sit there and it's going to start chewing on this, and it's going to give us some rendering, and it's going to give us the best rendering it can give us in 15 minutes. But let's say after 3 minutes or 5 minutes, the image looks fine. Like this is big enough for what I need for my presentation, and the image quality looks okay. You always have the option to hit the little red X and save and stop. What that will do is it will save the image exactly where it is without actually having to wait the whole time. So in this case, if I hit continue, it'll keep on rendering, right? But again, if you hit the little red X and hit save and stop, it saves it out right where it was. So that's one benefit to using max time. I also like knowing exactly how long each rendering is going to take. Advanced control, you have a lot more control over all of your specific render settings. The downside is you don't have any control over the time. That's the variable that's different with advanced control. You can guarantee the results every time, but you can't guarantee how long it's going to take. Max time and max samples, the variables here are quality. The longer you let it sit, the better it's going to look. So max time is easy to visualize. It's just letting this image sit there in a giant real-time view for an X amount of time. So what are maximum samples? If I enable that, this gives me a slider to control the number of on-screen samples. So what the heck is a sample? A sample is a number of times that light bounces around in our KeyShot scene, hits some sort of material or the background or a ground plane, comes back in and hits a pixel. That's one sample. The more samples you get, the more accurate the quality is going to be. So the more samples you have, or the more samples you allow, that means it's going to be a better rendering. Simplified, but that's essentially what we're doing. But what it's also doing is it's just letting this real-time view sit here for a little bit longer. A good way to see how long your rendering has been sitting is if I go up to view or hit the H key on my keyboard. This brings up the heads up display, and this will tell me how long it's been rendering. So in this case, this rendering has been sitting here for just under 5 minutes, and it looks pretty good. The number of samples that have been calculated in that time is 134. Right? So these are not the same numbers, but they will give you a good estimate of what the quality is going to be when you actually render this. So if I wanted to render this out at a much bigger image resolution, in this case, you can see here, this is also the image resolution, looks to be right about 1600 by 950-ish. Then what I could do is say, okay, if I need, let's say, twice the number of pixels, so let's say 3000 by 1875, that's actually 4 times the number of pixels. So the image is twice as big, so it needs 4 times the number of pixels. And that means I set it to 20 minutes, 4 times the number of times, if I want to get the same kind of results. But again, the benefit here being once I hit render, then I can stop it whenever it looks good. But that's how we can judge it, right? Using max time or max samples, really similar. Here under samples, I can see that at 167, this looks great. So that's what I can set the samples to. But I know from experience, that's a pretty high sample value. Usually with 32 or 64, it'll look okay. But again, what we could do, we can kind of shake our camera, right? Or go back to our camera tab. Here you can see there's that camera that was saved whenever we took the screenshot, but I'll set it back to camera 1, and you see it resets the timer and the sample value. If we let this sit for a minute, then we get a good judge of how long it's going to take. That's my preferred way to render. The nice thing that you also have here is that you're not going to get a surprise, by hitting advanced control and working with the advanced control. Sometimes it can look different than your real-time view. And that's because in order to get really good advanced control, then you have to dial in all these values. My suggestion, if you want to get more information on the advanced control, definitely take a look at the manual because it breaks down every single one of these sliders in the manual and what they do. My suggestion is to try something like max time. If you render with max time or max samples, you will get a better representation of what you see in your real-time view. Another benefit you have there is that things like the interior lighting mode are going to work with max time or max samples, but not necessarily advanced control. So max time, one of the easiest ways to control what you see in your actual output. Those of you who have KeyShot Pro also get access to a local queue, but we'll cover that in something that's specific to the Pro features. But yeah, so let's say we were going to render this. I could let it sit for 10 minutes, right? And then hit render, and that's going to give me a much higher resolution image. So in this case, I'll save it as a PNG, get rid of the transparency, right? But this is generally how I tend to work, flat PNGs. And I just let that sit, hit render, and then it's going to go through and it's going to render this out and give me the best image it can give me in 10 minutes using that max time render, which is going to be the same as my real-time view. So I'll let this sit. If you have any questions about any of this, feel free to leave any questions down in the comments section. We'll respond there. Make sure to subscribe and like. And thank you very much for watching.